Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to provide you with an update as to what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about oil and gas infrastructure assets that Russia owns outside of Russia. If you follow the channel, you'll know that following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia has nationalised lots of different assets that were owned and built by overseas companies because President Putin decided that it was in the interests of the Russian state to do that. And what that means is that over the last 2 years, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investments that were made into Russia by overseas companies have been lost forever. And what we're now seeing is that other countries such as Germany and Poland are taking reciprocal action. They're taking ownership of Russian assets. And as you might imagine, President Putin is not happy about this, and he's decided to go to the courts to stop this from happening. So in today's video, we'll have a look at the infrastructure that Russia has built over the last 30 years. We'll then have a look at the major energy infrastructure assets that Russia nationalised from the German company Uniper and the Finnish company Fortum. We'll then talk about what's happening in Germany right now, because the German state, up until now, has been running some of these assets under a trusteeship. They haven't actually seized ownership of the Russian assets yet. However, it now looks like the German state is considering nationalising these assets, and as a result of that, Russia is very unhappy. They're valued at around $7 billion. We'll then talk about what's going on in Poland, where we've had a similar situation, and Russia is now taking Poland to the High Court and is seeking up to $1 billion worth of compensation for damages against the Russian state. We'll then have a look at what's happened in the Czech Republic. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary. So what I think the implications of these latest actions are for both Europe and the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you so much. Really appreciate that individual effort. And if you've signed up as a patron or a member, you're providing me with long-term support that helps me making more videos. So thank you so much. Now, before we dive into the detail on Russia's assets and businesses, I wanted to talk to you about today's sponsor, Ground News. Now, I've been working with Ground News since October 2022, and the great thing about them is that they're independent, they're not a news publisher, but they aggregate stories from all around the world. So what that means from my point of view is that when I've got a story that I'm looking to investigate, I can go to Ground News and find lots of different articles from all around the world giving me tons of information. And that really saves me time and energy when putting together deep dive videos such as this one. And if we look at the articles about today's video, you can see that Ground News carried detailed stories from the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Slovakia, Ukraine, Belarus, Greece and Serbia, which means that you're getting true international coverage, and Ground News also tells you the political bias of those stories and who owns those publications. And the great news is that you can get a 30% discount on a subscription to Ground News, or try it for less than $1 for the next month by clicking on the link in the description below, which is ground.news/Joe, or using the QR code on the screen now. Now, I think one of the interesting things when talking about oil and gas businesses and assets is how the industry is developed in Russia compared with the rest of Europe. 30 years ago, after the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russia needed help to develop its industry to become world class. So it needed multinational corporations such as ExxonMobil, Shell and BP to come to the country and help it to design and build facilities, and also it needed help in paying for those facilities. So what we saw is the establishment of a variety of joint ventures. So when BP and Shell went into Russia, they set up a joint company which they owned partially and the Russian state owned partially. So this was a genuine cooperative agreement where both sides benefited. Russia benefited because all of these facilities got built and it was able to extract all of the natural resources out of the ground and make some money from them. And those companies benefited because they were sharing in the profits. So it was a win-win situation. Now, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the majority of those companies decided that politically they no longer wanted to deal with Russia. They didn't agree with what Russia was doing, and therefore they no longer wanted to invest into the country, and also they didn't want to take any profits. So they walked away from tens of billions of dollars worth of investment and also hundreds of billions of dollars of future profits. But they decided that that was the right thing to do. But in some situations, other companies decided that they were happy to carry on with their trading relationship. And two of those were Germany's energy company Uniper, which was operating a number of power plants in Russia that it had constructed, and also the Finnish business Fortum, which was also operating a variety of infrastructure assets. But despite the fact that those companies were happy to carry on operating as normal, President Putin decided that he wasn't happy and that those businesses should be nationalised. The Uniper business in Russia operates 5 power plants. The total installed capacity equates to around 5% of Russia's total energy requirements, and the company employs 4,500 people in Russia. Fortum owns 7 thermal power plants in Russia. 6 plants produce electricity and heat for the market, while 1 produces only electricity. In addition to the power plants that Fortum operates, it also has a joint venture in Russia with a portfolio of 3.4 gigawatts of wind and solar plants. On Tuesday the 25th of April, President Putin of Russia signed a decree establishing control of the Russian assets. The decree, outlining possible retaliation if Russian assets abroad are seized, showed Moscow has already taken action against the German business Uniper's Russian assets and the assets of the Finnish energy business Fortum. The decree said Russia needed to take urgent measures to respond to unspecified actions from the United States and others it said were unfriendly and contrary to international law. So in terms of setting a precedent, it's very clear. Russia has seized those assets, it's taken control of them, and there hasn't been any compensation offered to Uniper or Fortum. And actually Uniper, the German business, had to be bailed out by the German state. It has effectively been nationalised as well, but not for the same reasons. It was nationalised because it was about to go bankrupt. So we've got a situation here where Russia has seized assets. So you might expect that if other countries decided that they wanted to seize Russian assets, that Russia would accept that and say, well, we've done it, so it's only fair that you do it as well. But as you might imagine, that isn't the situation. President Putin is not happy for anybody to touch anything Russian outside of Russia. Now, the majority of Russian assets overseas are just pure assets. Things like the pipelines that were built following the development of the oil and gas industry to actually deliver oil and gas to various countries. And those pipelines were generally paid for by the recipient country, and then Russia held a residual stake. So they might have held 50% alongside a German or a Polish business. And a lot of those assets have now been seized following Russia's invasion of Ukraine to make sure that they could still continue using those pipelines. However, Russia did invest into a number of businesses. So these are actually trading companies that own various businesses all around Europe. And one of the biggest investments was made by Rosneft, the Russian oil business, into 3 refineries in Germany that provide around 15% of all of Germany's fuel. At the time of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia had 2 major business interests in the oil and gas industry in Germany. The first of these was the German subsidiary of Gazprom. So this was a business that was involved in the buying and distribution of natural gas in Germany. Now, that company was actually a trading business. It was buying gas directly from its parent, Gazprom, and then selling it to various companies in Germany. So following the invasion of Ukraine and the application of sanctions, it caused problems for the company. And also one of the other big issues was the fact that gas prices started to spike all around the world as a result of the disruption to the global supplies. And the company itself was actually referred to as CZECH. So CZECH started trading at a loss because it had locked into a variety of contracts to supply gas at a certain price. And because it was now having to buy gas in the markets at a much higher price, it started losing money. And as a result of that, Russia didn't want to know. They didn't want to carry on their involvement. And that business was nationalised by the German state to save the supply of all of the gas. So basically, Germany had to bail the company out because it was shipping huge losses. It made around 10 million euros of losses in the first 6 months, and as a result, it was nationalised. So the Russian interests stopped at that point, and there were no complaints from Russia because obviously it was walking away from a company that was making huge losses. However, the other major investment that Russia had in Germany at that time were 3 oil refineries owned by Rosneft. And those businesses carried on making a profit. As the price of oil went up, it went up for everybody. So all of the customers had to pay higher prices. So those refineries were now making super profits. So this remained an attractive investment from Russia's point of view. And the German state decided not to nationalise those 3 refineries, but rather it put in place a trusteeship, which meant that the supply of all of the refined fuel coming out of those refineries would be maintained. So it was securing all of the supplies for the German consumers. And we now have a situation where Germany have renewed that trusteeship and they're now considering whether or not they should nationalise these assets. But as you might imagine, Russia isn't happy about that, and it's now threatening legal action against the German state if it does nationalise all of these assets. And the estimated value of everything that Russia owns is around $7 billion. But when you take a step back and think about what's happening here, this is exactly the same situation as Russia had with regards to its power stations owned by Uniper. And Russia decided that it was going to nationalise those and not give any compensation at all to Uniper. But now that Germany is considering doing the same with these refineries, Russia is really not happy and is saying that it's going to go to the courts and threatening all sorts of legal action. Now, when we talk about the nationalisation of assets, it's very easy to think in terms of big picture terms that the state is simply stepping in and taking over all of these different businesses. And that seems quite logical from a big picture perspective. However, when you think through the actual practicalities of how this works on the ground, there are companies that are involved in all of the different countries who are operating these assets. And it's those companies who are suffering as a result of what's happening in Ukraine. Now, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, President Putin came out and stated that all unfriendly countries had to make future payments in rubles if they wanted to keep getting gas supplies. And this was a big issue for a lot of countries in Europe. And Poland was one of the first countries that came out and said, categorically, we will never pay in rubles. We don't want to do it as a point of principle. And as a result of that, they were the first country that had their gas supplies switched off. But when you think about what that means from an individual company point of view, there were companies in Poland who had signed up agreements with their Russian counterparts to provide billions of cubic meters of gas, which they had a commitment to then provide to all of the customers in Poland. So the fact that Russia decided that it wasn't going to supply any of that gas was a breach of contract. So if you're that company, you've got an obligation to supply all your customers. If Russia is no longer selling you that gas, you've then got to find it from somewhere else. And one of the main ways that most countries in Europe did this was by buying liquefied natural gas, which was much more expensive because you had to then put all of the infrastructure in place to convert that liquefied natural gas back into a natural gas form before you could supply it to your customers. So as a result of these actions, we have seen a whole host of breach of contract legal cases being brought against Russia and the Russian company Gazprom for non-supply of that gas. And somewhat bizarrely, Gazprom is now countersuing all of these different individual businesses for damages. Russian energy giant Gazprom has lodged a claim of more than $900 million against Polish companies in a St. Petersburg court. The St. Petersburg and Leningrad Region Arbitration Court documents showed that Gazprom seeks compensation of $710 million and $224 million from the Polish businesses Europol and Orlen and the Polish arm of Ernst & Young. Polish state-controlled business Orlen took over the Polish section of the Yamal pipeline in October, which meant that Gazprom no longer had a stake in the Polish business Europol Gaz, which owns the Polish part of the pipeline. Previously, Orlen and Gazprom both had 48% stakes in Europol Gaz. Europol Gaz has in turn been demanding compensation in the courts from Gazprom for lost revenue and for a lack of gas transmission through the Polish territory from 2023 to 2045. The St. Petersburg and Leningrad Region Arbitration Court ruled in November that Europol Gaz will have to pay a fine of around $1.6 billion if it continues to pursue a 6 billion Polish zloty lawsuit against Gazprom in Sweden. And it's not just Polish businesses that are now being sued by Russia. On the 6th of March, a Russian court decided that Czech firm Net4Gas will have to pay a fine of around $123 million unless it drops a lawsuit against energy major Gazprom over missed payments. In April 2023, Net4Gas, a natural gas transmission system operator, said it would start arbitration proceedings against an unnamed Russian oil major after a government minister said that the Czech company had not received payments from Gazprom. Until the Nord Stream pipeline stopped shipping gas to Western Europe from Russia, Gazprom paid Net4Gas and other companies fees for the use of infrastructure. In response to the announcement from the Russian courts, Net4Gas said it is considering the possibility of an appeal, but first and foremost is of the view that the decision of the Russian court should not be recognised or enforced in any relevant jurisdiction outside of Russia. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think what's happening with regards to Russian assets overseas is really interesting. Over the last 2 years, we have seen a variety of assets that are held in Russia being seized by the Russian state. Some of these have had a nominal value attached to them, maybe €1. Some of them have had no value attached to them. Or where there has been some sort of payment, the Russian state has implemented the law that it introduced recently, saying that any assets had to be paid for at a minimum of 50% discount. So the most that you could achieve would be half of the value, but in many situations, it's basically no value. So Russia has taken a very aggressive stance to overseas investments in Russia. But what we're seeing now is that when Germany is coming round to actually deciding what to do with its refinery businesses, which it absolutely needs to keep trading to keep all of the oil and other fuel supplied into Germany, Russia has decided to take a very aggressive counter approach and is threatening legal action through the courts. Now, in terms of the reality of the situation, I don't think any courts outside of Russia are going to deem in favour of Russia. However, you have to look at the legal position of all of these situations, because Russia is passing laws and changing all of the rules because it's within Russia. When you're talking about countries in Europe, they've signed up to the European Commission and various other international bodies, so they have to stick by what the law says. And it's not quite as simple as just saying we don't like Russia, therefore we're going to take all of those assets, thank you very much. You need to have a legal case to prove why you're doing it and why Russia won't get any benefit going forward in terms of the value of those assets. And I guess what's likely to happen is that even if these assets are nationalised, if there is some value attributable to them that goes back to Russia, Germany is likely to have to pay some form of compensation. Now, in the situation where we were talking about the gas trading business, CZECH, there was no compensation paid. That business was nationalised. However, it was about to go bankrupt. It was making huge losses because it had agreed to all of these commitments. It had to provide gas at a certain price to customers, and the German state didn't want those prices going up because it would have caused major problems in the German economy with rising inflation. So CZECH just had to swallow the losses, buy gas in the international markets, not from Russia, at higher prices, and then sell that gas at a lower price to consumers. So it was guaranteed to make losses. So when Germany nationalised that business, it was really just continuing the trading of the business. It didn't want it to go bankrupt because it needed those gas supplies to keep flowing to all of the consumers. So there wasn't any value at all attributed to that business. But when you're looking at these refineries, there is obviously real value. They're making profit. They always make a profit because they're buying in crude. They then add value through the refinery process and then sell the finished products at whatever the market price is. And generally, refined products trade at a much higher level than crude prices. So Russia wants compensation for these assets. But is that fair? Should Russia actually be paid for compensation? Because Germany is in recession right now. And the reason it's in recession is because it was so dependent on Russia for all of its fuel supplies, particularly the Nord Stream pipelines, which were providing huge amounts of gas. Obviously, all of that flow has stopped since those pipelines were blown up. But also Germany was taking in large volumes of Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline, and that flow has also stopped now. So the German economy is in dire straits as a result of its loss of relationship with Russia. So it does really stick in the throat, I think, for the German authorities to have to pay anything to Russia in compensation for the ownership that it has of these refineries. And it will be really interesting to see what Germany decides to do. If they do decide to nationalise all of these assets, which looks like it's extremely likely to happen at some point in the near future, will they agree to pay any compensation to Russia, or will they just decide that no compensation is needed and they're going to take the assets at zero value in exactly the same way as Russia did with the Uniper assets? And let's not forget that Uniper actually had to be nationalised because it was going bankrupt. It had lost so much money. The German state had to step in and take a big stake in that business to keep it trading. So Germany has suffered severely, probably the most out of most countries in Europe, apart from Ukraine, obviously, as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I don't think the authorities will be very happy having to give anything back to Russia in compensation for seizing these assets. So the overall summary of today's video is that over the last 2 years, Russia has benefited from the seizure of lots of different companies in Russia. It's now very unhappy that Germany and countries like Poland and the Czech Republic are trying to get some money back from Russia as a result of the business disruption that they faced following the invasion of Ukraine. And when you take a step back and think that Russia is now claiming damages and legal compensation, it does seem a little bit bizarre. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's episode, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.